So my inspiration for Candace of Kingstown, it sprung from a desire to imagine an alternate history of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, of the island that was called St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Uh, in my undergrad and during some of my postgrad research, I was compelled or propelled towards exploring aspects of our country's history that were not recorded in the textbooks to which we were exposed in school. And so I decided, all right, it was more like a thought experiment for me to imagine what St. Vincent would have been like, how it would have developed, its evolution, its trajectory, if it had not had that encounter with the Europeans, if perhaps Ivan van Sertima's theory of Africans reaching the Caribbean was more than a theory but an actuality, and what would it have looked like for the island that we call Saint Vincent if it had been settled by African travelers from different West African cultures, how they would have interacted with the indigenous people, and how the country would have developed over time with that particular mix. So the inspiration came from that desire to imagine what if St. Vincent was not colonized by the Europeans, but was settled and evolved with a mixture of indigenous and African peoples living in harmony and constructing their societies. What inspires me to write generally? Well, firstly, it's the desire to read stories that I have not seen, firstly. Secondly, with regards to my poetry, what inspires me to write my poetry is a desire to process certain experiences, the desire to examine my reaction to these experiences. You know, when you're going through life, you encounter different adventures, to put it nicely, put it in a nice way. And poetry for me often springs from a desire to examine my reaction to these moments in life, these adventures, and to process them and see, you know, to examine myself as I move through this world, basically. So that's why I write poetry. When did I know that I was a writer? Probably from very early. No, not probably. I definitely knew I was a writer very early. I blame my parents because they exposed us to a lot of books when we were little, and they inspired this desire to read, which then organically translates into a desire to write, or at least that is how it happened with me, that I was inspired a lot by, you know, the sort of trips of the imagination that I got while reading certain books as a child, and wanting to write my own adventure as well. So I would say that I knew I was a writer from very early, when I was a wee tot in Sign Hill. How much time do we have? Who are my favorite writers? How much time do we have? Okay, let's see. My favorite writers include Nalo Hopkinson, Octavia Butler, Olive Sr., Toni Morrison, the great Ellsworth Shake Keane, Peggy Carr, Lorna Goodison, Anna Broadbur. I could go on, and lately, Beverly Jenkins. But it's not an exhaustive list because I read very broadly, not a brag, just a fact. And I can I can highlight writers from across the genres that I gravitate to, but these are just a few that I will name off the top of my head right now. My favorite genre of writing, I find that I I sort of gravitate to the speculative, speculative slash science fiction. So the arc of my creative writing bends towards the speculative. So I could start off writing about the history of St. Vincent, or I desire to write about the history of St. Vincent, and then it veers off into alternate history, which is a form of speculative fiction, right? Or in other efforts that I have in the mix right now, I am writing a story about uh, a boy meets girl or girl meets boy sort of romance type storytelling. But because of my speculative leanings, it becomes a girl meets boy meets boy meets boy, because our girl protagonist is an intergalactic spacefaring pirate. So the arc of my storytelling bends always towards the speculative. I am currently working on a collection of poetry. I do not have a name for it. Uh, some of it is inspired by our prevailing condition with the global pandemic, and then it was compounded by what happened in St. Vincent in April last year. So I'm currently working on some poems around those experiences. In terms of prose, I shared with you already an excerpt from Candace of Kingstown. That is the major prose project that I'm working on currently. There are some other small, shorter stories, shorter works of fiction in the works, but those are the two, collection of poetry and the larger body of fiction, the larger work of fiction, Candace. Those are the ones that are dominating my attention right now. Oh my gosh, the best book that I have read. I would have to say, well, there are two. There are two best books, if that's possible. Can we have two best books? I think so. Right. So on one hand, there is Indigo by Beverly Jenkins. It's a historical romance. It has absolutely nothing to do with my research interests or my current academic career, but it was a lovely journey into the historical past of the United States, specifically focusing on the life of a formerly enslaved woman named Hester and her efforts to secure the freedom of slaves who are escaping along the Underground Railroad. She's a conductor on the Underground Railroad. And yes, it's a historical romance, but there are also bits of history that Beverly Jenkins researched and provides in that text that makes it a very um, worthwhile and rewarding read. So that's the best prose that I've read in the last year. In terms of poetry collections, I would say that is the Pandemic Poems by Olive Senior. She basically was chronicling her response to the ways in which the pandemic has influenced our language and shaped the way that we interact with each other. And she captured her own reactions and thoughts and reflections on the experience in a very lovely collection of poems that I had the pleasure of reading it last year, and I'm currently enjoying. When I say I had the pleasure of reading it, I was reading it live because she was sharing each of these poems on her Twitter feed, and then she put them together in a collection, and it is, I wouldn't say therapeutic, but it's a very enjoyable experience to read one of our own Caribbean writers, Sister Olive, as she was processing her experience during the pandemic. And so, yeah, those are the two best books that I've read in the last year or so. Okay, I'm reading currently Rhonda Garcia. I'm trying to track down all of Rhonda Garcia's short stories. Rhonda Garcia is a Trinidadian writer of speculative fiction. So I've started reading some of her stories, and it's my mission right now to track and trace all of them and to go through all of them. I'm reading The Anchorite Awakes currently. And my favorite from her is The Bois, which is set in a future alien planet colonized by Caribbean subjects. Again, with the speculative. So that's what I'm reading right now.